Compared to most Yu-Gi-Oh players, I would say I'm more optimistic about Konami's handling of this game. I've agreed with a lot of the changes that they've made over the past couple years that a lot of people don't agree with, such as no set date for ban lists, the actual ban list changes themselves, and the set releases and rarity changes that a lot of people weren't really fans of when they were first announced. I'm saying this because it's important before I make this video to mention that when Link Summoning was first announced, once again, I had optimism. I had some maybe reservations about this mechanic in particular, but I always head into any new change that Konami makes with some sort of optimism so that I'm not just one of the many people yelling at them for ruining the game. Today, now almost 2 months after Link Summoning has been in the TCG, I wanted to make a video talking about the last 2 months, where Link monsters stand right now, and my problems and concerns with them for the future. The first thing that I want to say is that while Link Summoning makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Difficult from a spectator standpoint, I will say that almost all new mechanics have done this. So what I mean is that Link Summoning, if you look at any game now, it's going to look completely different from any game before Link Summoning. This is probably the biggest change ever because it actually adds new card zones in weird spots and then requires people to use those card zones to summon from the extra deck. The next biggest change was definitely pendulum monsters because especially if you use the pendulum zones in the spots that they were supposed to be, it created really weird looking field layouts, and luckily that's now been corrected. I think this is an aside, but pendulums probably should have always been in the back row so that it wasn't so weird looking. But pendulums are the biggest one, where if you compare those to synchros and exceed monsters, those didn't really change the layout of the board, it just added a new mechanic. Now, this obviously does affect looking at older games, because if you watch older games, there's a lot of situations where one player has 2 level 4 monsters and they can't get over their opponent's boss monster, and it's like, well, why don't you just overlay for Castel? So I kind of understand that even though Link Summoning in general does affect how the game looks from a spectator point of view, pretty much every older mechanic has done this, so I can't complain too much about that. However, I will say that this is the most confusing new layout, and the reason that it's confusing, and one of my biggest gripes with Link Summoning from the get-go, was that you can't avoid using Link monsters. And if you do avoid using Link monsters, you can't play the same game that you've been playing for years. So let's say you leave Yu-Gi-Oh! For a couple years, maybe you left in 2012, and now you want to come back, and not only do you have to learn about pendulum monsters, you now have to learn about Link monsters. And the important difference there is that if you're learning about pendulum monsters, you don't actually have to use them at all. Yes, you might go up against them in tournaments, or at least you might have before Link Summoning happened, but with Link monsters, not only do you have to learn how to summon Link monsters, you have to play with them if you don't want to just summon one extra deck monster at a time, and that's really confusing. And back to the spectator thing, it's still not comfortable for me to attack directly horizontally. When you have a monster in the extra monster zone and your opponent has a monster in the extra monster zone, it is kind of weird when you think about it that you're like attacking sideways. The animation, when that ever happens on Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro or Dueling Book, it still looks strange to me. That's not how I feel Yu-Gi-Oh! Should be played, and it's basically not how any other card game is played that I know of, at least the popular ones. It's always just one horizontal field of monsters. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing that this is something that Yu-Gi-Oh! Does by itself, but it looks weird, and especially from a new player trying to pick it up, it would definitely be confusing. And in regards to Link monsters helping out good players by rewarding field placement, I think there's like this general idea, at least in the friend group that I hang around with, that games should reward the good players, and they should punish the bad players, but not to a point where they don't know why they're getting punished, and it's just frustrating. An example of this would be in Hearthstone. There's a card called Meteor. Now, Meteor does 15 damage to one minion and then 3 damage to adjacent minions. You don't really have to know how Hearthstone plays to understand how that card works. Just put it in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Context of like destroy a monster and 2 monsters next to it. That's a card that rewards good players because the good players then make sure to set up their field accordingly so they don't lose to that card. Where when it happens to a bad player, maybe it happens a couple times and they realize, oh, I have to start playing around this card, and then they better themselves and they start playing around it. However, that card doesn't add a whole new horizontal layer to the board. It doesn't really, it's not overly complicated. It's a simple mechanic that'll catch bad players off guard a couple times, but won't just punish every single new player that looks into the game. You can play Hearthstone without playing around Meteor. You can't play Yu-Gi-Oh! Without now thinking about all the different link arrows. So while that is good in that it rewards the better players, I think it goes a little too far in punishing the bad players. Now, I will say that this doesn't necessarily affect me personally, but as someone who over the past 6 years has seen a lot of friends or acquaintances pick up Yu-Gi-Oh! And then maybe drop out of the game, I think a lot of the times it's not even due to the money aspect, because at a casual level, when you're playing against other casual players, you don't really care too much about the money. You care more about how complicated it is. At least that's how I see it. And a lot of times when a deck type itself is too complicated, or the game itself added a new mechanic, I think a lot of people leave the game, especially those newer players that didn't have enough time to casually play the game, even when there was only so many mechanics. But then you add the link mechanic, now they really have to pick something up. Puts them in a rough spot. So I think this really hurts anyone coming back to the game, which I know I'm really hounding on this point, but it is really crucial, because one of the biggest selling points of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that there's no set rotation, so that if you quit the game for 5 years, you can come back and technically play the deck that you played. And I know I talked about that in a recent video, but I think that's a really important factor with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that you can come back after leaving and just play whatever deck you were playing. Obviously, you'll have to make a few Forbidden Limitless changes, but overall, you don't have to make too many changes to the deck. And this one in particular is huge. I mean, the last time that we had a change this big was not the pendulum monsters themselves, but I think the 5-card going first rule. That was something that changed how you played all older formats, especially like if you think of cross-banless tournaments. Do you let the decks that had 6 cards to start with, do you let them have 6 cards if they go first? And then do you punish the decks that only have 5 cards going first because they now have 5 cards? Is that fair enough? And I think that, I mean, this sort of really throws a wrench in any cross-tournament ban list, because you just let some players play with Link Monsters, and obviously you can't force the older decks to play with Link Monsters because they weren't even designed for it. Just creates a whole other problem, although that's not super relevant. I suppose that affects, to Konami, that would only affect like the generation tournaments, and those aren't really popular to begin with. But all this aside, I think my current stance on Link Monsters is that they're inefficient. They're inefficient at bringing new players into the game from a business standpoint, but they're inefficient to make from a player standpoint. I think what I don't like about Link Monsters, and that I've preached for now months, ever since they were released, is that it punishes only the mid-tier decks. And I don't really believe in a tier list, but I'm talking more about tiers in terms of how much you can do. So it doesn't punish decks like Zoo or any other deck that's going to be like the very top of the meta, because those decks can summon so much that they can actually make the Link Monsters and then continue to make their plays. And then it also doesn't punish the complete opposite end of the spectrum with decks that are either just so garbage that no one plays them, or decks like Barrier Statues that don't ever summon from the extra deck, because those decks weren't going to summon more than one extra deck monster at a time anyway. So what it does punish is all the decks that are in between those that could maybe summon 2 extra deck monsters at a time per turn if they open well, possibly 3 if they open like Soul Charge. And those decks now can't play the game properly, because instead of making 2 usable extra deck monsters, they have to make a Link monster, and then now they only have enough material for their 1 extra deck monster, which at that point you're asking yourself, well, why didn't I just make the 1 extra deck monster in the first place? This Link monster does nothing, which brings me to my final point, and that I truly believe Link monsters right now don't do anything, and that's really frustrating. Firewall Dragon is probably the exception to this rule, although it's really impractical to summon in most competitive landscapes. I know there's a FTK deck at YCS Toronto, but overall, you don't see Firewall Dragon in every deck like you did with Utopia or Stardust Dragon when those cards came out. But Link Monsters, they're just so bad. You have to go out of your way to make them. They all have ridiculous restrictions on summoning them. And when you do make them, they don't do anything except let you play old Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's so frustrating. Think about all the first wave synchros that were amazing that we got. We got Stardust Dragon, Thought Ruler Archfiend, Goyo Guardian, all these really powerful cards that did things that you weren't able to do prior to them coming out. I mean, prior to Synchro Monsters, because that was really the first accessible extra deck mechanic, you could only just summon those types of monsters when you drew them or used a searcher to summon them from the deck, like a boss monster like Judgment Dragon or Darkholm Dragon. But then when they added that mechanic, it was like, holy crap, now I can just summon these gigantic monsters from the extra deck. That's insane. Link Monsters, not so much. None of these cards do anything. How is this okay? Missus Radiant is by far the best Link monster in the game right now, undoubtedly, and that's partly because it's the easiest to summon, because you can use Zodiac monsters and you can use Gem Knight Seraphinite as half the summoning requirement, but it's also because it requires the least amount of investment and it gives you the most benefit. It doesn't do anything. I mean, it has like a defensive effect, but the fact that a card like Missus Radiant is the best Link monster of a new mechanic is just... it's truly absurd. It should not be like that. Even if you look at the first wave Exceed monsters, they were just leagues better than everything we have right now. I mean, I always mention this on live stream, but Decode Talker is straight garbage, right? I mean, it's so bad. It's basically a vanilla monster. I mean, it has a sort of neat targeting effect, but it requires 3 monsters to make, and it's like, yes, I know you can use Gofu, but Gofu's garbage. Oh my god. If you go back to some deck profiles when Metaphos players started dropping Gofu from their main decks, I believe like Chase Furman and Billy Brake both sort of pioneered not playing Gofu when everyone else was playing Gofu, and just listen to their reasoning why Gofu is bad, and the same reasons apply to right now. I know Gofu is like the go-to card for people. I know it's limited on the OCG ban list, but it's so bad. I mean, it's only good when you go first against no disruption, and all it does is once again take up 2 extra deck spots, the Proxy Dragon and the Decode Talker, to then play normal Yu-Gi-Oh! And then everyone after you draw that first Gofu is terrible. If you go second with Gofu, it's terrible. It's just, how have we gotten to a point where it's almost like a reverse power creep of sorts, which some might say is a good thing, but I think that for all the people that are arguing that power creep is bad for Yu-Gi-Oh! Or bad for card games, I think Link Monsters and Link Summoning in general is a great example of how that's just incorrect. You can't... imagine a world where you didn't have to summon Link Monsters to use your extra deck zones, and I know that changes the mechanic a little bit, but let's just say that there was just a 6th zone that was optional that you could use for Link Monsters, and then that would just give you an extra monster. Would anybody be playing Link Monsters? Probably not, except maybe Missus Radiant just to add back Max C, but even that's a stretch. And it's just like, the only reason Link Monsters are played are because Konami is forcing us to play them, and I think that's bad card design. I think overall, Konami has shown good card design, which I know a lot of people don't agree with, but I think overall Konami has shown pretty good card design in terms of giving you incentives to play extra deck mechanics without just restricting the other ones. I mean, you wanted to play Synchros because you didn't have to draw Polymerization. You wanted to play Exceed monsters because you didn't have to play Tuners. You wanted to play Pendulum monsters because they had a ridiculous mechanic of summoning from the extra deck. No one wants to play Link monsters. I mean, I know there's probably a couple World Chalice players that just love Link monsters, but no one really... people aren't excited to play Link monsters. Outside of like maybe this new Spiral card that came out, that's a good Link monster. But as far as the TCG right now, there's not a lot of people that I see that are like, man, they're just ready to summon their Link monsters from the extra deck. They're just, everyone seems to be complaining about it. And for a while, I tried to look at the brighter side of things. I tried to look for that greener grass. But I don't think it's there right now. I think Konami really needs to make better Link monsters. They need to make Link monsters that aren't just there to play old Yu-Gi-Oh! They need to make Yu-Gi-Oh! Better. That's what I think, at least. Please let me know your comments in the comment section below. I know this was like a long, ranty video, which I don't really do anymore, but this has just been a lot of stuff that's been making my blood boil over the past couple months here. But anyway, I'll see you guys later.